Good morning and welcome to the Resolution Foundation. My name is Lindsay Judge. I'm one of the research directors here at the Foundation, and I have the great pleasure today of chairing this event, which is part of our 5 challenges for the new government series. So far in the series, we've looked at the topic of labour market reform, and we've looked at the very contentious topic of tax, and we have another contentious topic to tempt you with today, which is the question of housing supply, where we're going to be looking in particular with sort of laser focus at the topic of the government's proposed reforms on planning. I have a fantastic panel to help me educate, inform, hopefully entertain you over the next hour and a quarter. We're first going to hear from my colleague Cameron Arif Adib, who is one of the researchers here at the Resolution Foundation and is one of the authors of the report that we're publishing on the topic today. We'll then hear from Sam Stafford. Sam is Planning Director of the Home Builders Federation, has many years of working with house building companies, I believe, Sam, and is also a chartered town planner. Sam, thank you for joining and giving us the industry perspective today. And then we'll hear from James Shuttleworth, who's Head of Planning at Salford City Council, and prior to that worked for Manchester City Council. And James is going to provide us with the public sector perspective, and is also hopefully going to tell us a little bit about the experience of working on the Greater Manchester Places for Everyone plan, which is a rare piece of planning at a high level, spatial level. So that's the plan, and then we'll open the conversation up to you. You can post your questions on Slido. The hashtag is building blocks. And if you're in the room, we'll try and do something of the old-fashioned way and get a roving mic to you at different points in time as well. So do get your questions posted and do get your questions cooking in your head. I think that's everything I need to tell you. So without further ado, Cameron, tell us what's in the report.
Thank you. So this is a report we published this morning, which I'd like to thank my co-authors, Cara Pachiti and Johnny Marshall. So what our report looks at is assessing whether the government can hit its 1.5 million housing target, and we particularly focus in on planning reform. So firstly, to put that 1.5 million target in context, achieving it would be unprecedented. So what this chart shows you is the number of net additional dwellings, so that's additional homes, which is the metric the government is using in terms of assessing whether it meets its target since 1970. And even during the peak house building years of those 1970s, because of the high rates of demolitions there, we've never hit that annual 300,000 target, which would be needed to hit that 1.5 million by the end of the Parliament goal. So in that sense, achieving it for this government would be unprecedented. So a quick recap of what the government has announced in terms of driving to reach this goal. Firstly, an overhaul of the planning system is how they characterise their approach to housing supply. This involves a reintroduction of mandatory house building targets for local planning authorities, the release of lower quality grey belt land from the green belt for development, and this includes their golden rule on 50% of any development on that green belt must be affordable housing. More pressure on local councils who fail to keep up to date their local plans, a reform of compulsory purchasing rules to make acquiring land cheaper, 300 extra planners. So in sum, you can really say it's planning, 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 which they have earmarked as what they want to do in terms of reforms to unlock housing delivery. So why have they focused on planning? 3 main reasons. Firstly, the planning system is highly discretionary. So what this chart shows you is across the last 20 years, local authorities in the top 10 and bottom 10 in terms of the number of major developments, that's developments for 10 or more housing units approval rates. And what you can see is in the bottom 10, approval rates for these applications hover around 60% or below, whereas in the top 10 local authorities over the last 20 years, they're all around the 90%. So there's a huge variation between local authorities, highlighting how discretionary the planning system is. Secondly, there's evidence that areas that approve more of these applications build more. So this is quite a complicated chart, so I'll start explaining it with blank, without the data on it. So on the x-axis here, we've got major dwellings approvals, which is that 10 or more units, applications approved, per 1,000 dwellings to ensure it's scaled for the appropriate size of the local authority. And on the y-axis, we've got annual completions, so houses built per 1,000 dwellings. And what we see here is breaking local authorities down into 20 different bins, depending on how many major dwellings they approve. So that's represented by the different dots on the screen. There's a clear relationship between the more dwellings you approve, major dwellings that you approve relative to your size, you see more houses getting built. And to put this into context, per 1,000 dwellings, the average authority in the top half of approvals has seen over 50% more completions, houses built, compared to the average local authority in the bottom half over the last 15 years or so. And thirdly, the scale of the uplift in the price of residential land suggests there's an uncertainty premium with pricing as the constraint. Now, we would expect land that has planning permission to cost more than those without, because there's a time and money associated with getting planning permission. But the scale of the difference between residential land and other types of lands in England really highlights the extent to which that planning is acting as a constraint, because it's introducing an uncertainty premium. So digging deeper into the government's planning reforms. So the 1.5 million target focuses on England. Planning is a devolved matter. And one of the areas that they've looked at is housing, is how they allocate local housing targets. This has attracted quite a lot of interest, particularly because of the changing nature in the way that the targets have been allocated across local authorities. And there's been some talk about how they now focus slightly on the wrong places. And this sort of stems from this chart, which highlights that housing formula has increased proportionally targets in the more affordable areas of the UK. So if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, sort of the most affordable decile of local authorities has seen their housing targets rise proportionally far more than as you move across towards the right of the chart. And so this has led to some concern that maybe these targets, the new formula, are not focused on the right areas, and there's some merit to that. What we would caveat, and what we do caveat in that in the report, is that in levels terms, the targets are still broadly in the right places. So if you look here, because they have increased targets across the board, what that means is that even in the least affordable half of planning authorities, so that's deciles 9 and 10 on the chart, the number of the levels of house building targets there are still higher. And to put this into context, it's around 30%, with the new targets mean that around 30% more homes are planned in the least affordable half of local planning authorities compared to the most affordable half. And what's really driving a lot of the changes is the changes to the house building targets in London. Now, previously under the old formula, to hit the house building target in London, you would need to have increased house building rates by around 260%. So they were particularly unrealistic. So the tweaks there that they've made have made hitting the house building targets in those more expensive areas more likely. Secondly, another area they've looked at is this brownfield first and then grey belt approach. So what we've looked at is we've analysed around how many homes could you build on the brownfield, and then from the grey belt as they define it, and we used as a proxy that's for grey belt, green belt that's previously been developed on. And what we see is there is certainly strong things to be praised around this, in terms of you could build around 1.1 million homes on the brownfield and grey belt with this approach. But that would still leave you a shortfall of around 320,000 homes. And to put that into perspective, that would need development on land to the tune of the size of the current grey belt, which is highlighted by the first bullet point in green. Or something else that we could look at is densification. Now, the government hasn't spoken much about densification, and it's definitely an area to look at. And those 320,000 homes, in terms of densification, what we would be looking at is around 44% of brownfield on grey belt homes being increased in height by 1 story. With that increase in story size, you could probably hit that 320,000 target there that's currently missing. And thirdly, the government is definitely right to focus on capacity. This chart shows you the real terms cuts in terms of planning departments have faced in local government since the 2010s, and you can see there the huge cut of 36%. But the 300 additional planners that they've pledged would reverse less than 10% of the total fall in the public sector in the number of public sector planners since 2010. So it's really a drop in the ocean, and it amounts to less than one additional planner per local authority in England. So to sum up, the reforms definitely go some way to helping address some of the problems we've seen, but they are quite modest in nature. And so what we draw upon and what we argue is that planning reform should be viewed as a necessary but arguably not sufficient in terms of the government hitting its target. And why? It's because planning reform alone shouldn't be viewed as a silver bullet. Now this is quite a simple chart that just shows the number of housing starts since 2009 and the number of housing units granted planning permission across that same time period. And what you can see is that while they do follow similar trends over time, there always remains a substantial gap between the number of units that are granted permission and the number of starts. So in 2023, this was around 80,000 fewer starts compared to the number of units granted permission. And this does point to other constraints beyond the planning system that are limiting housing supply. And what we can't get away from is the need for direct public investment. So at the peak house building year of 1968, nearly 2 in 5 homes were delivered through the public sector. Now this has dropped substantially, and if we look at 2023, just 24% of new homes were delivered by local authorities or housing associations. History tells us if we want to build at scale, there is a role for the state to play. And that's not just important for building at scale, it's also really important for housing mix. So what this chart shows us is the number of affordable homes looking at 1990 to 2023. If we assume a similar ratio of building through Section 106, so that's developer contributions in terms of affordable housing to get planning permission, that would suggest if the government hits its 1.5 million target, we would be looking at around 40,000 additional affordable homes by the end of the Parliament. That would take us back to affordable house building rates of the early 1990s. So that's very welcome. But the issue is developers might try to negotiate this down. Now, I talked earlier about the golden rule on the grey belt, 50%. But on the grey belt and brownfield land, there are likely to be quite high remediation costs. And that means that developers are likely to try and negotiate down their Section 106 contributions. And in that sense, in order to get these developments built, the number of affordable homes, if we rely entirely on the private sector, might not be this 40,000 homes. And that's why it's so important for direct state intervention as well, to ensure not just the scale that I highlighted from the previous chart, but also the right housing mix. So to conclude, the government's focus on dramatically increasing housing supply is encouraging given the acute housing affordability pressures across the country. Planning evidently has a central role to play in their system, and given the way that the highly discretionary and varied way planning policy currently operates, reforming the planning system is a plausible route, we argue, to boosting house building. But planning reform alone is unlikely to deliver either the scale of the house building or the tenure mix that the government hopes to achieve. And ultimately, we argue that planning reform must be delivered alongside direct investment into social housing. And next year's spending review certainly marks a critical juncture for this, with the renewal, potential renewal of the Affordable Homes Programme, and that's when the time where the government can really put money where its mouth is on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameron. That was a real whistle-stop tour of a very rich report, and I would definitely commend the full report to the audience. Sam, there's so much in the report, but there's obviously so much that the government has put on the table too. What's the industry kind of feeling about it all?
I think the change in tone is stark and very welcome. I don't think it unfair to say, in the broadest sense, excuse me, that the last parliamentary term was a complete waste in planning terms. There was a white paper in 2020 that spooked the horses. Then the industry was waiting for a response to that. And then you might remember the whole Theresa Villiers backbench rebellion obfuscation around housing targets. And the system fairly flatlined, and the profession, I don't think it's unfair to say, James, suffered some kind of, has gone through some kind of existential crisis with, a confidence being lost amongst the profession and amongst the those who operate within it. And I thought one of the most striking things about the July the 30th announcements was how measured they were, how I don't say professional, but the Secretary of State previously would have launched a consultation, tinkering around the edges of the system with great fanfare at some fancy building in Westminster and give a speech with a fancy title. There was a statement in Parliament. Everything appeared online at the same time, which hasn't happened previously. There were letters to all key stakeholders setting out expectations of what it is to be achieved. Now I'd welcome a conversation as to the extent to which it will actually achieve what it sets out to achieve, but the tone and the purpose and the narrative is 180 degrees different to that that was the case under the previous administration.
Wonderful, thank you. James, did you have an existential crisis? And are you recovering from it?
It was probably so existential I didn't notice it quite as starkly as Sam maybe did. But I would agree. I'd agree with lots of what Cameron, really interesting presentation and great report. One thing I sort of almost take issue with in the start of probably the government's approach is it talks about an overhaul of the planning system. I don't think that's what we've got. I think, as Sam said, it's a change in tone, and I think the change in tone is really important. You can kind of see the paroxysms happening in communities who are sort of perceived what's going on there. But I think it is an opportunity. I think so. My sort of reflection on the planning process since, I suppose, 2012 is it's kind of been an exercise in producing sticks and using bigger sticks to push development through a planning process. And I think now's an opportune time to think about whether we should shift that approach. And it isn't. I'm not sort of saying. We talked before. I was saying what's the best thing we have, and I said Michael Gove, because it made it really easy to do planning at a local level because you didn't have to do anything. You could just, interesting greenbelt site. No, we're not interested. Doesn't matter. But it is this sense of now we've got an opportunity to try and think about how we can reset some of the dynamics about how development happens and how growth happens. And I think planning debates aren't planning debates; they're debates about development. And the main issue we're facing is that there are local communities across the country who resist development. I think now is a really good opportunity to think about other opportunities. Is there a chance to try and say, how can we make the local reaction to development more positive? So I almost haven't got a dog directly in the fight because I'm at Salford City Council. Our last housing delivery test result was 280%. So I'm sure Cameron's Camden figures would look funny if you managed to achieve 280%. So we haven't got an issue with housing delivery. We do have issues about some communities having a more concerned position towards development. And I think now is an opportunity to think about how the planning system exists beyond just national planning policy framework. When I talk to our city mayor about our response, he doesn't think this is planning. Planning goes into all sorts of areas. Planning is, well, what's the funding for social rent? We say, well, no, it just says we can think about social rent. And you go, oh, that's useless. Planning is, how do we provide doctors and reasonable health provisions? How do we plan schools? How do we do all the open space? How can we make sure connectivity to green spaces is effective? I think that should be what we can tackle in planning. So it's kind of, I think, it's an important position to get to in terms of how you shift the debate around planning. I think if it just remains as being a big stick to try and knock development into a bigger open goal, then it becomes it will become a more reductive process. And in the report, it sort of points out that there's a strange reallocation away from London. So London's targets fall, but to achieve those targets, London would still have to achieve the highest uplift in development of any region, which does suggest that high targets might not be the only part of the answer. And so I won't say anything. I know there's other questions to come about how we can plan in a more positive way.
Well, I did want to ask you whether putting the targets back on a mandatory footing gives more power to your elbow as a local authority.
I mean, it changes the discussions officers have with members, but it doesn't change. So I was at a community meeting last night, talking about not talking about a site, which was remarkable. It normally is in these areas, but there's not a lack of understanding, but planning is quite complicated. The NPPF is an involved document, even compared to what came before it. But there's an understanding of the impact development has on their area, and there's a sense of a central government document telling them that impact doesn't matter. doesn't really change anything in terms of their response. So the idea of hitting objections and resistance isn't really affected by this. It's almost we now have a stronger reason to try and appeal to that sense. But there is this definite sense that our area, our community is changing, and it's being imposed upon us. Mm-hmm. And I think most local politicians will respond in a predictable way in those circumstances. And you can almost see that, Sam talked about a story from 12, but more recent, the Teresa Villiers era. It eventually comes back to bite you. If you don't resolve that political sort of schism between people affected by development and politicians, it will always eventually, there'll be a cycle of, and I wonder whether Sam's members are thinking, this looks like a window to get our consents through. And as somebody who represents a council, has a real focus on city centre development, but also has greenbelt and countryside. We hope that we don't lose focus on the core, because there's an era now, but I think it would be great to have an area. Imagine how planning would be if areas, if there were villages who saw development as a genuine chance to enhance services, to have better schools, and to see how they could have access to sort of an effective transport system. And then we might not be saying, we're going to double your housing targets. You might be saying, well, hold on, we just need to make sure we can plan things in good time.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's open the discussion out a bit. I think I wanted to start really positive and to cluster a set of questions around what problems the government will solve for with its proposed planning reforms. And there's a great one here, Sam, which I might bring up on Slido and direct to you. Which is house building is known to be a risky business. And this is definitely something we heard in the course of our research. We held a round table, which you very kindly came to, Sam, and we heard this a lot, that there's a whole set of reasons about why the business is risky, and one of those is the uncertainty that the planning system brings into that process. So the question is, house building is a risky business. Do these reforms go far enough to de-risk it for developers? What do you think? What would house builders say in response to that one?
That's a good question. The short answer is probably no, actually. I think there's a conversation. We can talk about grey belt. I could talk about grey belt all day, but I won't. What Cameron talked about was the discretionary nature of the planning system, and what that means is that you could not drive past. If I was a land manager or a land director working for a builder, big or small, and this does affect small builders particularly, but if I were to drive past a vacant factory site in Worsley or wherever, James, I would not be able to simply go on my phone and go to Salford's website and see whether or not the principle of development on that site would be supported by the council, because it may be subject to, I don't know, it may be subject to an old employment land. The plan might be 10 years old, subject to an old employment land policy, even though it's previously developed. And this isn't the case in Salford, I don't know why I'm being unusual. But my point being is that you would not be able to assess how long it would take you to get planning permission on that site and how much it would cost, speaking to what Cameron said before. And so it's discretionary in the sense that you would go to the council and say, would this site be suitable for development? And you might speak to a junior officer rather than a senior officer who's been around the block a little bit, and they may say, I can't tell you that, but if you pay £15,000 for a pre-application consultation, I might be able to give you an answer. But even so, that answer will be, if you did this, and if you did that, and if you submit this, and if you do something else, you might get planning permission. So then you might do that. You might spend £500,000 getting planning permission, and you might get to planning committee eventually after 2 years, and it might depend which way the wind's blowing on that particular night as to whether or not the members are going to approve that planning application. In that sense, there is very little in this round of reforms that would bring, and ultimately, if you're going to get anywhere near 300,000, regardless of who builds that, whether that's the big builders then having, scaling up, introducing SMEs back into the market, councils emboldened to build themselves, it's the land. It's the land that is absolutely fundamental. And where the 2020 white paper was going, and I think it was too bold and it scared the horses, but it dipped its toe in a kind of codified zonal sense. But when I say it dipped its toe, it went full blown towards saying, let's just have a zonal planning system, which, is not, that's not how reform tends to, but you could proactively, if local authorities were planning proactively rather than reacting to planning applications, you could update that employment land policy. You could create a supplementary planning document that for a priority area that established the principle of development and then allowed the development industry to invest with more confidence and certainty. So that's a very long answer. I will say no.
James, we'll come back to the question of land in a minute, but do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I do have almost a year in private practice, so I'm quite the expert on commercial planning, alongside 25 years as a council, so I'm not an expert on commercial planning. But I can totally see Sam's point of view. It's the risks in planning come from not knowing the outcome of the argument.
Yeah.
And the changes in the NPPF seek to sort of weigh the argument on one side opposed to the other, but it's still there, and there's still a process, and it's interesting. I say my wife has a BBC view that everyone hates BBC, so they must get it that right. This might be not the case with the NPPF, and so as a council we look at it, we think, oh my God, this is such an open goal for the green belt. But I've spoken to developers who think it's also vague, and you can see the grey belt is completely vague. It's probably much larger, I think, when it comes down to it. It's effectively a sequential approach to green belt, which is probably sensible, but it is fraught with interpretation and negotiation, and there will never be a local area which thinks, you know what, I think we're a grey belt.
Yeah.
So I can see it's the rules of the game embed uncertainty and greyness, and I think the 2020 reforms were interesting to me, and Sam's right. I think they came in just too abruptly.
Yeah.
And if there was an effort to try and say how can we create a positive version of planning, and then planning as an exercise which was in every other sense of planning, thing you do before you do it. Rather than a sort of a passive, this is what we'd like to happen, fingers crossed, commercial world, then you might be able to say, actually, a zoning approach would work, because we all have much more confidence in the planning system. We have more confidence that the outcomes we'll get are positive locally, and there's maybe a sequential thing going on that would address that, and would enable, and I was thinking enable council, so we have ambitions that go well beyond our means to deliver, but they probably are commercially viable with the right kind of building blocks in place behind them.
Yeah.
And the ability to deliver that is what I think we should be aiming for. So I think, as I say, as Sam said, it's a change in tone which doesn't remove the uncertainty.
Great. Let's talk about land, because you mentioned that, Sam, and that's obviously absolutely critical. There's a question which I'm scrolling through to find, which was about compulsory purchase orders. We're obviously beginning to touch on the grey belt too. Angelica, I'm hoping you'll find it for me. Here we go. It's basically asking whether reforming the compulsory purchase of land would be a game changer. Cameron, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what's actually the government's proposing in this space?
Compulsory purchase of land, I think it's useful to look back at the history of it. So it came, this concept became important in the 1961 Land Compensation Act, whereby that act ensured that if you've got a plot of land and you sell it to, for instance, the local council or the state, then there's a premium put on top of that land for the chance of getting planning permission. So that, of course, raised the prices of that, and that's part of the reason that we saw in that chart where sort of the level of house building from the state sort of fell after that. The effects of that act sort of took shape. And the government has proposed, or is given soundings, that it will reform compulsory purchase of land and remove sort of this concept, or limit this concept of hope value, that would enable local councils to acquire land much cheaper, and therefore we would likely, as a result, be able to see the public sector delivering more homes. So in that sense, I think it's very welcome that they're looking at reforming this area.
James, what do you think? Is it a game changer?
I think if the government does, yes, I'm sure it will be a game changer, one way or the other. But I think it's really interesting from our point of view. Sometimes I think I'd like us to be more active in terms of compulsory purchase. The proposals at the moment look at its implementation on green belt or grey belt. I think it'd be interesting to see if we could have a more active means of using, whether you use compulsory purchase as a means of value capture in more urban settings. That'd be interesting too. I'm conscious the land market is complicated and there are implications of wading in. So what I would call for, I suppose, is better value capture for local areas, which might not be land value capture in itself, but There are regeneration exercises that rely on handouts from government, which they provide to us because the growth we're proposing nets a benefit to the Exchequer. So in that sort of BCR process, I think they should try and reform it so we can access the benefits we get from promoting growth more effectively. It doesn't necessarily, at the moment, the CPO approach seems a slightly simple way of it costing nothing for the government, but potentially putting it onto the private sector as a source of funding. I've almost no objection to where the funding comes from, but I can see that could be a complicated way of doing it. But there should be a means of enabling councils to be more proactive in planning and delivering development. And I mean, the compulsory purchase side for me, purely as a naive planner, feels like an option worth looking at. But I'm conscious there'll be counter views we might hear shortly.
Great. Let's move on to the question of the extent to which planning is a binding constraint. Now, this is obviously a topic that Cameron looked at in the report, and it's this question of whether, if all the planning reforms that have been proposed were put in place, they clearly solve some problems, but would they really unleash housing at the kind of scale that we expect? There's a question here which I might use as a kind of starting point, which is, since 1990, there have been 16 major planning reforms and none have really shifted the gears. Why not? But Sam, what do you think? Is this a game changer? I hate to keep using this word game changer, but I mean, would the reforms really change the volumes that house builders were putting onto the market?
Blimey. At heart, what the government, I think, is trying to do is to deal with, or what it needs to do, I think, is recognition of, and what it's trying to do is deal with the obstacles for local authorities getting local plans in place. One of the consequences of this incessant round of reform is that the number of local plans, which is a local plan is the delivery vehicle. It allocates the land, it sets the tone, locally, it sets aspirations and ambitions locally. The number of local plans published in draft by local authorities, submitted to the planning inspectorate for examination, and adopted, all those three things, were the lowest last year for a decade. So local plan making has effectively collapsed under the watch of the last government. And that has a material impact then on the amount of land available to build in any given area at any given time. And the reason that local plans typically fall apart from a planning point of view, there is a political angle to this in having, at a kind of micro level, local elections 3 years out of 4, and planning constantly being that kind of battleground to which James has alluded. Put that to one side. The reason technically that local plans fall apart typically is this target business? What number should we be planning for? And if an authority can't meet it, how is that unmet need being distributed across a wider housing market area? And that then takes you into Greenbelt. So all of those three things, the numbers being put on a empirical and substantive footing for a period of time, the reintroduction is as a commitment. I don't think the government has been bold enough and there is a missed opportunity, but there is a commitment to universal strategic planning, which the previous government stripped away to deal with that greater than local issue, which would have, I think, enabled Salford and the other Greater Manchester authorities to get to where they needed to get to earlier than a joint development plan document if that arrangement had been different earlier. And they've dipped their toe, and this is probably the most interesting thing about this MPPF, they've dipped their toe into the Greenbelt space. The Grey Belt, whatever it is, I can tell you what I think it is and what it might mean, but what it is at root is an acknowledgement, and I think the press release around Grey Belt before the election said as much, is that it's recognition that we can't build the homes the country needs without building on land currently identified as Greenbelt, which is, again, a 180-degree shift from the last government that shut down. Any authorities that didn't want to touch their Greenbelt didn't have to touch their Greenbelt. The tone here is there is an expectation that you will touch your Greenbelt if you can't meet need in any other way. So the problems have been, you could say, fairly, I think, reasonably diagnosed. There is a question as to the scale and the pace and the ambition in dealing with those things, and whether it would make a material difference to local plan coverage and planning for that 370,000 within this parliamentary term, but it is, I think most actors in this space would say that it is trying to right the oil tanker and stick it on a more progressive path.
Great. I'm going to ask you a similar question, James, if that's okay, but we're using another Slido question. So there's this one, which I thought was a good one. New homes obviously can't be built without land or planning permission, but does it follow that they will be built if both of those things are in place? Have you got land and planning permission in Salford together and there's no homes being built on it? And if not, why?
We're a really bad example. I mean, I think I'm always meant to come on these things and promote the council, because I'm asked to go and come here, I suppose. So I should. This is a chance to do it. I mean, so as I said before, housing delivery test, 280%, so we are seeing homes being built in Salford. Our 5-year supply position is 8.5 years, which is on our, so 3 places for everyone. This is the plan of 9 districts, not Greater Manchester quite. We have a higher target than we would have had otherwise, and a higher target than we have through the proposed method as well. So we are seeing the process of finding land for homes and seeing homes being delivered. I mean, it's an interesting approach, I think, in that most, 85-90% of our homes won't come on allocated sites. So we won't use allocations in the city centre, we won't use allocations in Media City, just because they feel too clunky as a means of dealing with development that changes every couple of years. We'll probably create regeneration frameworks, which we can quickly update. But in that sense, where land comes forward, and where we can put together commercial schemes, we've seen development come along. There's the last couple of years, I suppose it's edged off a bit from. I think we had a high a few years ago, about 4,000, which is a lot for Salford. I think the challenges in terms of the land challenges, it's interesting. It's almost, so Sam talked about land as this thing that drives the housing industry, having the sites and we all hate the land banks, even though they seem completely reasonable to me to have a supply of sites coming forward. To us, the land is a sites, and each site's a campaign, and it's in the exercise of identifying, so through Places for Everyone, we've released 2 sites for housing. We tried to release 3 for housing, but one of them got knocked back. And that is so much political capital has gone into releasing these 2 sites, and they're 700 homes altogether, so it's not huge compared to some of our schemes. We'll have a half-hectare site in the city, which will do double that. But it's so I think if it still comes the challenge of releasing land and the perspective of land from the housing industry, which is the requirement to have a supply which achieves a long-term supply of homes is different from the one sometimes from the local perspectives, which is what do we have to look at now and what can get us to the point where we feel in a more comfortable position. And I think one of the risks of the current approach, so Sam says that the local plan should be the means, the mechanism for releasing land. It might be tricky for some of the councils, particularly some of the councils which are looking at significant increases in housing targets and have suddenly paused the plans, or even more comically, suddenly accelerated plans, which seems, there's one that's just getting going from publication to submission in a month, or 2 months. But the difficulty here is the benefit of preparing a plan into the proposed system don't seem that much better than chancing your arm with a planning by appeal, because the targets are really high. Yeah. And so the Greenbelt process, and the government has been clear that there will be some limits, but because Greybelt is quite loosely defined, I think you'll have to probably hit the bar of getting to the point where you say we can't meet our needs anymore is potentially much higher than it was, well certainly much higher than it was under the current system, which I think we could agree is a slightly silly approach to planning for a growing economy. But my concern would be that you would look at the challenges faced by the current housing targets, the exercise to go through to even achieve a lower target through proper planning based on the NPPF will be difficult to sell politically. And so I think in terms of the idea of achieving 1.5 million homes through these changes in this Parliament is really challenging. It would feel like a local plan. So Places for Everyone, I think, was a really positive thing to do. It took 10 years, more than 10 years? 10 years certainly at least to run through the process. If we had to start again, so the annual target within Places for Everyone at the moment is 10,300 for the 9 districts. It would go up to 13,000. That would be a significant exercise to identify. And we probably know exactly what the sites are because we've looked at them. We've had certain ones knocked out, but it wouldn't be a quick process. So I think it's. I I mean, I think you know, with engagement with the industry, identifying sites and bringing them forward is probably a reliable way of doing this. But actually, that process is fraught, and I think 5 years isn't long to achieve that with what is a fairly sort of a attritional approach to local engagement.
There's a perfect segue actually to this question that's come in on Slido, which I'm also going to send your way, James. What role should metro mayors play in the reformed planning system, and should this involve powers? I mean, you've 10 years for places for everyone, and you still didn't get all the councils in GM in there, did you? But is there more scope?
It's complicated, isn't it? I mean, I think the London example is slightly different and not analogous to. So London secured powers, didn't it? It secured powers from sort of a higher level to London. So and then could apply it. What we're looking to do in Greater Manchester, we're passing powers up locally to the Greater Manchester Mayor. As a representative of Salford, no way they shouldn't have more powers. It should be up to us to do stuff. As a planner, I can see it. I'm a fan of subsidiarity. I think they should make decisions at the right strategic level. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to see what happened with Stockport. If as the proposals and the consultations suggest, and some of the letters from the Secretary of State suggest, strategic planning is going to be something they're looking to apply more. And you'd have thought some of the metro mayors would have that role. That would be a different challenge for Greater Manchester. I think there obviously is a logic in making decisions at the level where those decisions, the outcome makes sense. Because most of that, most of the responses you have at the local level are completely reasonable. I mean NIMBY is a sort of a very pejorative term, but it doesn't seem an illogical response. It probably just shouldn't be the dominant or influential response.
There's a couple of questions, Sam. I'm not going to put them up. I'm going to sort of paraphrase them if I can, but they're really around, I suppose, informed a little bit by the Letwin Review and the CMA report, and sort of arguing, even if we had a more kind of, liberal planning regime or a more predictable planning regime, and the land and the planning permissions were there, that companies won't build out because they'll build out to a certain price point and then they'll stop. How fair do you think that is? That's
entirely fair. That is entirely fair. What the industry would push back on, as the CMA found, is any sense that there is a deliberate slowing. If what you mean by land banking is the owner of a piece of land not bringing that land to the market, and most landowners are not motivated sellers. The Crown Estate has owned land for 1,000 years, and builders work on 3-year cycles. The Crown Estate works on 500-year cycles. Most landowners are not motivated sellers. And if you're talking about land banking in the sense that a owner can sit on that plot in a landmark location, in the town centre, and wait for that value to rise to the point that maybe they do, that's where you kind of intervention and CPO kind of space. Where a builder, big or small, because a site for 50 homes might cost as much to get planning permission as a site for 500, where that small builder has spent that money, and has bank loans to service, gets that planning permission, the idea that they wouldn't want to get on site and get cash back into the business is for the birds. That's not a serious. Yeah. That's not a serious conversation. But yes, at the point at which that land deal is done, an assessment is made as to what those houses, the rate of sale, which is determined, and the price of that property, which is determined by the second-hand market, and a figure will be attributed in a spreadsheet to the value of those properties and the pace at which an assessment will be made. And if they are selling faster, then that site is more profitable than you told the accountants it would be when you did the land deal. But yes, there is then a business decision to make if sales prices in that area fall lower than the extent to which, at a point in time, a number was put in a spreadsheet. Now, the issue is, on any given site, that's the operating model of any given builder, big or small. The issue is that there isn't as much plurality in the new homes market as there should be, in the sense that there is a trend towards certainly in rural authorities in the counties, allocating fewer larger sites. And there may be 2 builders on there, but there will be this is what Oliver Letwin called the absorption rate. There is only a number of people in any given housing market able and willing to buy a certain house of a certain type at any given point in time. Now, if you are, I always use South Ribble as the example, because I think they did put all of their eggs in one urban extension on the edge of Clitheroe that was promoted by Taylor Wimpey. So Taylor Wimpey may have had 2 sales outlets, but if you didn't want to buy a Taylor Wimpey house in Clitheroe, where else are you going to buy houses in South Ribble? So you need a plurality in the land market to encourage the different actors to build different properties of different types and different price points, and that is the way. Not necessarily, it's not going to be the builders, builders will, with a degree of certainty, a house builder, a large builder would probably increase the divisional capacity with any individual divisional business at the highest end is about 750 homes a year. You could probably do, everybody busting a gut, an individual house building business unit could do 750. So with a degree of confidence around land supply in a certain area, if you're below 750, you can you could plan to increase your output to about that type. And the bigger builders, that's probably the cap on, without opening new divisions and so on and so forth, I won't bore you with the details. But you need that plurality within the land market of other actors building different properties if you're going to get anywhere near increasing output.
How does that notion of plurality sit with the idea of new towns?
Oh gosh.
Sorry.
Georgina and I were at an event yesterday. What did I say about new towns? I said I try to walk a zen-like tightrope of tranquility between joyful optimism and naked cynicism. And we have been here before with new towns. What if now we've got a task force, and there'll be a report to government. Everyone knows probably where they could and should go. And this in the spirit of this government, with its mandate, with its majority, is there an opportunity to be bolder? New towns won't happen. I mean, if you're talking about putting wind in the sails of sites, big schemes that are already in the planning permission, already in the planning system, so draft allocations, an authority that does want to identify a big urban extension or a new town, if you're putting wind in their sails, there's no additionality there. If it's additionality over and above the 370, and Matthew Pennycook did say, I think, on TV that the new towns are over and above the 370, which I don't think would go down particularly well in some non-green belt authorities, in the Oxfam kind of area. Point being, they won't happen unless the government puts a red line on a plan and grants development corporation status and says that's happening. Yeah. And that, if the government has used, if the government feels as if it's used its political capital in going, if this is as far as the government is comfortable going using up its political capital and doesn't want to go any further, then that won't happen. I would respectfully contend.
There's a question from the audience. We've got a roving mic here if you just want to wait for that to come.
Thank you. It's not so much a question as perhaps a comment. Can
you identify yourself?
Yes, so my name's Danny Kay. I'm a director of a consultancy called Sheridan, ex-development director at Guinness, worked for Peabody, Commission for New Towns, and I work a lot with house builders, landowners, housing associations and so on delivering homes. The planning reforms, I think, generally are pretty well received. So I think there's unanimity on that. There are some issues, but I think the fundamental problem we have at the moment is, so long as these planning reforms are in the right direction, even with land and planning, we could be all dressed up but nowhere to go, because fundamental issues with the economy, the state of the economy, the nature of development economics across the country, capacity in the system, and capacity in the system is about actually having people, planners, but also builders, skilled workforce to actually build the homes. And there's a fundamental problem with local government finance. So 2/3 of local authorities are on their knees financially. Those with housing revenue accounts desperately need a transfer of some of the existing debt to a national basis to give them capacity to build. Otherwise, they're going to struggle. So it is probably, without being negative, and I don't want to be negative, it's probably unlikely we're going to deliver 1.5 million homes by the end of this governmental 5-year term. Not because these planning reforms don't have merit, it's because we are at quite a volatile state in our economy, and there are fundamental things which need to change, including reduction of interest rates. So lots of positives, but then one thing that the government could do is for quick wins, and new towns is a great idea, but you need a 40-year strategy for new towns and the establishment of development corporations. But quick wins or quicker wins would be to be very focused around stalled sites, focused around gap funding. They are setting up a unit, as I understand, focusing on via Homes England on stalled sites. But these are sites, I believe, 1,000 homes plus. And actually, I think they're missing the opportunity here. There's an opportunity for focusing on stalled sites of 50 homes to 500 homes. That's where there's a lot of sites that need gap funding, particularly brownfield sites.
Great, thank you. That actually takes us on very nicely to 2 questions. I will come back to the audience shortly, but I want to cover a few more in Slido. There's one here which is, what do you see Home England's role as a national agency in the housing sector? So perfectly following on from Danny's questions. James, what's your experience?
We've just we're developing a partnership, including Homes England. So we see it's a really positive contribution to our growth story. I think we would characterise it as we are a place hopefully that can work with development partners, government partners, and that's been the key foundation to enable us to kind of put forward propositions that Homes England feel they can invest in, and Homes England hopefully get behind and accelerate delivery. We're obviously the challenge is we're obviously always very, very interested in seeing what Homes England's funding approaches are, and we sort of go spending round to work out how much investment we can hope to secure. There's a kind of Greater Manchester angle where we like to get ahead of others, but we obviously also there's a sharing of the jam across Greater Manchester, which we need to try and balance. And I think the examples of the accelerated housing unit. I mean, at the moment, I don't think it's suggesting funding, is it? It's just sort of expertise, which seems that's always what councils want to have. Central government telling them, here's a better planner for you. So I mean, Homes England is really vital. I think it comes back to it's the exercise of localising centralised resource. If you could find a way to decentralise that resource and put the resources in local places, it would enable you to be even more effective, I think, on some of these. I mean, I suppose you wouldn't call them stalled sites at the core of Salford, but you'd call them challenging sites that could become very significant developments with some of that, with a bit more heavy lifting.
Great. I want to pick up on another point that Danny made, actually, which is the point around it's not all just about rules and regulations and land and planning permission, it's also about the workforce in terms of the delivery of the 1.5 million homes. Now, Cameron, you cover that a little bit in the report. You didn't have time to share it in the presentation. Do you want to tell us a bit more about what you found?
Yeah, definitely. So on construction, that point is really well made. So if we look at sort of the share of workers in construction, that's fallen quite substantially since 2005. It's quite an ageing workforce as well in terms of the share of workers over 50, and it's increasingly reliant on migration. So in that sense, there is certainly an argument in terms of that it's going to be a challenge construction-wise to actually deliver these homes, even with perfect planning reforms. Where I'm probably more optimistic is the ONS has got some data which suggests that you could add around an additional 40,000 construction workers to this sector who've got the currently right skills, who are just working slightly different professions. So in that sense, I think certainly probably more confident that maybe construction won't be a binding constraint, but there certainly is merit to the challenges that it will face actually delivering these homes, but also whether it might also require reallocation from other infrastructure to housing, and whether that could cause knock-on effects, for instance, on our delivery of net zero challenges, net zero targets as well. So in that sense, I think there's mixed evidence out there in terms of how binding a constraint construction will be, but because of that additional 40,000 workers that the ONS has identified, I think I'm probably slightly more optimistic that it won't be a binding one.
I'm going to come to the panel, then I'm going to pick up a few more questions. Does that resonate with the experience of builders? Are they concerned about staff and people to actually build these homes?
Yep. I think that's. I think, as far as obstacles is concerned, I think you'd point out. As I think, the broader macroeconomic factors, interest rates only just stabilising. This is the first time for a long time there isn't any support for first-time buyers. It's not, obviously, as you can tell, I'm not a specialist in very many areas, but certainly not necessarily in skills. But I think what I would say, there is a link back to planning, in the sense that if you can plan with certainty to increase your supply chain, you can plan to increase your output over a period of time. You can invest more with more certainty into that skills and workforce strategy and things. So I think there is an overlap with land and planning there.
And James, the government's obviously said it's going to fund 300 additional planners. As Cameron points out in the report, that's less than one per local authority. So I'm assuming that that's not going to change the dial significantly. But tell us a bit more about kind of capacity within planning departments.
At the moment, obviously, Salford is managing to grant enough planning permissions to achieve quite a high level of housing delivery. Obviously, our service would be improved. The more resource we could have, we could do more planning in terms of preparing our local plan if we had more resource. Some of the government's proposals around fees, obviously interesting to us in terms of that. It seems to be small beer in terms of Sam's $500,000 to get a site near being ready. If I could just get a little bit of that would be great to fund it. I think the context in the council is always really challenging. I think it's hard for us to secure funding that comes into planning departments for planning, and it's hard to do it in an almost sort of ethical position when we look at some of the challenges councils are facing, like the really important stuff around adult and children's social care, and recognise that's where our budget pressure is. To sort of have an influx of funding through fees, it will be challenging, I think, to make that case to retain that. I think if you can get to the position where councils see planning as a growth activity, that's how you see it. And our Salford does see it as an investment in staff. So our staff we're not measured in quite in a corporate way, in a commercial way, but we're expected to add value to the city by bringing in council tax, bringing in business rates, which isn't enough to justify development. But there's a business case for a planning department is based on that. But our fees still go and meet sort of shortages elsewhere. Yeah. Budget goes elsewhere. So, I mean, the important challenge for us is trying to give really good service to applicants, try and do it as quickly as possible. No one wants to sit on applications, and I'm conscious colleagues in development management have remarkably long workloads to deal with. I mean, far more things when I was in my days in development management, which conditions were 5 or 6 conditions, and that was great. Materials match, and so it's a much more involved process, and there's a need for resource to do that. And the point about resources in the construction industry do illustrate that the idea of sort of reducing down housing growth and planning misses the point, and the government needs to try and see it as a holistic challenge they need to tackle on all fronts. And it's also the point Sam makes around what motivates house builders. It's the problems house builders are solving are not the ones the government's trying to solve. They need to recognise that they need to solve their own problems. The house builders are a really important means of achieving that end, but they need to try and put in place the pieces to achieve the goal they're looking to do, which is not just to make house builders successful companies, because that could happen without us satisfying the aim of providing houses we need.
Great. I've got an absolute ton of questions coming in on Slido around affordable homes and Section 106, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But let's take a couple of questions in the room. There's a hand over here, Alicia. Can you please tell us where you're from?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? I'll sit back down.
That's fine.
Hi, my name's James and I'm a civil servant. The question for the session is, can the government hit its housing targets? And I think the answer from Cameron's slides is no. So I guess my question is, how can the government hit its targets? You guys have talked a lot about the constraints in terms of there's no money, the sector's struggling a little bit, and the opportunities of the majority, and maybe some more goodwill after a change of administration. So I know there's never any silver bullets in planning, but what's your one answer for how the government can hit its targets?
Cameron, do you want to tell James what the answer was in the report?
Yeah, I think what I would like to emphasise is that if it does hit its target, it would be. unprecedented in that sense. And I think what we're likely to see is, and then over the next 2 years, you're not going to probably hit that 300,000 a year that you need. And so therefore you're reliant quite a lot on the final few years of the administration before the next general election to that be above 300,000. I think what the primary thing that you need is there needs to be looking at direct investment from the government if it wants to hit the targets. The point earlier well made on the pressures that local authorities are facing on their housing revenue accounts is one area, for instance, because those accounts have to manage huge challenges in terms of maintaining stock and damp and mold issues and huge issues that we're seeing in some of our social housing. And therefore the challenges of the local authority then use that also to look into investing in more affordable housing and more housing in their authorities is a massive challenge. So I think without that direct investment from government, it's going to be hard. And I think that's why the next year's spending review is going to really be the watershed. And I think maybe my opinion on whether they can hit that 1.5 million will change after that spending review.
I think your question, James, also takes us nicely onto the last sort of cluster of questions that I wanted to pose to the panel, which is really, you know, we obsess about 1.5. The government has set 1.5 million homes over the course of the Parliament up as its kind of primary objective of success. But you know, clearly there are other objectives of success for housing and building as well. So I want to sort of turn to that. And there is a lot of questions about affordable homes. So I want to bring up this one from Jules Birch, and he says, how serious are the current problems with Section 106 system, both for affordable housing delivery and house building overall? And how can they be fixed? A massive question. I know it feels very unfair to throw this one at you. I've been throwing massive questions at you all morning. But James, do you want to have a go at that one first?
So if the current problems with the Section 106 system is that we're asking too much for Section 106, I think that's probably not unreasonable. I think we have, so different councils across Greater Manchester certainly have different approaches. Salford's very active in Section 106. We have an expectation that most development will contribute to Section 106. We use our clawback, sort of overage, whatever you call that, the system quite actively. Up until, well, certainly over the last 5 years, affordable housing has gone up the list of the things that we are trying to seek to secure, and clearly that just makes costs go absolutely through the roof. We have a policy of 20% affordable for the least affordable parts of the city, up to I think 40%. It's probably our highest for our high, which is very high for Greater Manchester. Probably just dead normal for London, isn't it? Everyone's 40%. And we recognise viability means it often can't be achieved. And I think there is a position, I'm going to go with my trope of how you enable places to plan properly. There's become an expectation that Section 106 will meet all sorts of associated infrastructure requirements, which don't feel to me to be necessarily directly linked to developments in the way that you'd think a community was operated. So I'm not sure. I think education, health, there should be a means of providing the education and health facilities we need, not by relying on a developer to fund it. I can see the residents should contribute funding it, and that's how taxation works. There should be means, I think, of meeting that infrastructure challenge out with the Section 106 system, not least because it's timing-wise, it obviously doesn't work at all, does it? Because you end up paying for infrastructure you need just when you finish developing. It seems sort of symptomatic of the fissures in the system which don't allow us to prepare places to undertake effective placemaking. And I think just to quickly answer James's question, if he applied to all of us, my quick answer, none of my answers have been quick, was make development more popular. And that's part of having it, I think, is having an effective way of providing the infrastructure, working out how you can plan in a way which says we can talk to residents and say, this is our plan for a place, and they can have confidence that this is what will happen. But at the moment we will say, this is our plan, we place everyone, these are our sites, these are the infrastructure we like, and no one believes will be delivered. And we know full well it will be an absolutely tortuous process, trying to secure the contributions. So if you took the view that the challenge is to create a system that delivers more popular development, I think that would be a big step towards, certainly through the planning process, delivering the consents you need to achieve your targets. There's obviously loads of other challenges as well about capacity, about other resources, but I think if you can consider how that works, and that goes to the Section 106 system, because 106 is then seen as this kind of, and in government policy, it's seen as a kind of solve all. So, if there's a shortage there, just put it on the 106, just stick it on the 106. And I had this conversation with our city mayor about a site somewhere in London, and they said, oh, they're really positive. He's an altruistic developer. Obviously, he's making his money. And so sort of look at the last government, how land value, which I think you use in the work, Cameron, and Salford's hectare of housing land in Salford is about 1.5 million, and in this borough of London it was 56.5 million. And I think that's a different kind of discussion we have with our developers. So I think finding means of delivering infrastructure in a way that doesn't rely on a sort of a slightly mythical viability in development would be a positive way of resolving 106.
Sam, do you agree?
My answer to James's question is you're only going to build 300,000 if you plan for 300,000, and we're building 220 because we're planning for 220. But that's a soapbox that I won't get on. In specific answer to Jules's question, I think if you were to ask the HBF membership what the biggest obstacle to getting planning permissions are, it is right now, over and above the role of statutory consultees, which we haven't touched on in the context of this stalled sites point. Over and above mandatory BNG, which is causing tremendous issues to particularly small and particularly brownfield sites. It's a legal requirement to provide 10% BNG, and that is going to have in time will show that to have a really fundamental impact on land coming forward. Nutrient neutrality is still an issue in vast swathes of the country, but the HBF membership right now would probably say that registered providers not bidding for the the affordable housing component of the Section 106 agreement is the most fundamental blocker to getting consents and getting on site. And if this isn't on your radar, I think it was Inside Housing did a deep dive on it a couple of weeks ago. If this isn't on your radar, I think that was that's a good piece. But then it's a political choice. It's a political choice that the conditions attached to the Affordable Homes Grant Programme, I'm not an expert in this, I'm not an expert in very many things, but the conditions attached currently are such that RPs are prioritising the refurbishing, legitimately and rightly, prioritising the refurbishment of existing housing stock rather than development programmes that would see them take on the 106s, and builders are then left unable to complete the Section 106 agreement and discharge conditions and get on site. So a long roundabout waffly answer to Jules's question, very serious, and that does need immediate attention.
Thanks, that's really interesting. I know there's lots of questions in the room, but I'm also snowed under with questions on Slido. There's one question here which which I will answer, which is someone asking what define affordable. I mean, an affordable home in this context is anything that's offered below sub-market price, and obviously there's a whole range of levels that can happen at. There's a question here which I think is really interesting that I want to bring up, and it slightly speaks to something that Cameron raised very tangentially in the presentation, and it also speaks to the issue of kind of appetite and local objections. So building flats rather than houses means more homes can be built on the same amount of land. So why don't we build more flats in the UK and not spill out onto the green belt? I mean, we've had conversations when we were doing our Economy 2030 project last year in Greater Manchester about densification and the need for that. And obviously you can build, you can densify around transport links, and that gets you a good kind of growth boost as well. But what do you think, James? I mean, do you see builders don't bring forward plans for flats because they know there's going to be so many local objections, or are there other kind of planning reform constraints around that? Why don't we densify? We don't look anything like many European countries where flats are much more the norm.
I mean, we definitely do build flats in Salford. Some developers will suggest it's pretty much all we do, and I think that's one of the challenges. I suppose it's kind of reduced down to a sort of certainly in Greater Manchester and lots of provincial cities is like a very high density, smaller apartment, so 1, 2, a few 3-bed apartments, and then the more sort of typical sort of volume house builder stock out in the suburbs. I think the challenge that we're facing at the moment, so the city centre is growing really well, providing lots, very high density, is how we then transition to something which hopefully looks like a more continental model of higher density neighbourhoods that can appeal to a plurality of households. And that's the challenge, I think, is how we provide a mix of house types through higher density development. We will constantly face the challenge that there's obviously lots of demand for the flats we're building, and they obviously meet the demand across the city region. But there are some households who wouldn't choose to have a two-bed flat in a 40-storey tower. And so how we can pivot that market, flex that market to provide a more variety in terms of housing options, but do so in that high density form. And that feels like it has to be some kind of public intervention, public support to try and enable that market to be developed. I think the sense at the moment is there isn't an established market in many places across Greater Manchester where we can demonstrate the demand for that. Once there is, then hopefully it'd be much more commercially viable. But it feels that's so. The city living in Manchester didn't happen without public support. There needs to be another sort of phase, another period which enables us as councils, I think, to take a much more proactive role to say in some of the spaces between city centre and our more sort of stable suburban locations to say how can we do something. We see these areas transition from old industrial sites into something probably more focused on commercial, not residential and mixed commercial. How can we provide a greater variety of high density options? So in Manchester, the idea is flats or houses, the idea is too many flats, so in places for everyone. Manchester and Salford are providing probably over half of the numbers. But conscious that there's a certain type there.
Yeah.
The challenge is flexing, I suppose, and that would be planning. I mean, I think if we talk about trying to get away from just looking at numbers in terms of planning, but in terms of placemaking, having the ability to actually to achieve outcomes like that feels like proper planning to me, and it's providing the sort of places that are up for the growth, which we definitely are, the tools to do it at a higher level and maybe slightly less reliant on what is commercially viable, but to provide a range of outcomes. It feels like that's the way we would achieve some of the outcomes of having higher density. So it's in my head sort of flats. Like I was thinking, I know what home that is, but I know what anonymous means. It's that sort of when you look at European cities and you think, well, these flats are different from the ones we're building at the moment.
Yeah, well, certainly when we did some deliberative work last year in Greater Manchester, we talked to people about densification. Their immediate go-to was, you're going to put me in a tower block, and that's not where I want to be. And that conversation about kind of lower level, but living in densified areas was really productive. I think we probably have time for one more question from the room. I saw another hand up. This lady here, please.
Hello, I'm Layla. I'm an economist at the Department for Business and Trade, and I also grew up in social housing. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on how social housing, if it can help the government meet its housing targets, and also what you think of the right to buy policy and possibly abolishing it.
James, I'm going to throw that one googly at you.
Yeah, I'll have to try and channel my city mayor. I think that's the most important thing we can achieve in all our developments is increasing the amount of social housing we provide. Obviously, in a viability sense, it's really, really difficult to make it stack up. Salford has its own housing company called Derive, which is based on a French philosopher who about his Derive book had sandpaper cover, so it was uncomfortable next to other books. So that's the kind of sort of place he's coming from, our city mayor. But it feels like it's the priority from our point of view is to try and increase the amount of social housing, and to do so in a way that isn't open to right to buy, right to acquire is a huge challenge for us. So that's I think we sort of kind of joke in Salford that we have all these priorities, and the city mayor, everything's a priority. But we all know that when it comes to the social housing, including affordable housing in particular, social is top of that list for us. But which doesn't mean we are churning out hundreds of social housing units. It's tricky, but it feels like it's the sort of term genuinely affordable housing is sort of getting traction now, and I think that's what politicians will mean by that. So in terms of affordable housing, Lindsay's saying anything below the market rate. Our local plan says it's affordable housing is stuff you can access on local housing allowance, but that isn't obviously what lots of providers are assuming. So social housing feels like it's an absolutely essential part of the mix to try and primarily address the challenges we face in terms of our housing crisis as our politicians see it, rather than just the numbers. I'm sure in numbers terms it's probably essential as well that council are able to partake in that development side, but it feels like an important thing to have more and better social housing. We used to do it really well.
Cameron's chart showed that perfectly. Time is drawing to a close. We've got 1 minute. I wanted to do a poll to kind of take the temperature of the room and the virtual room too after all that you've heard this morning. So this is the poll. Vote quickly, get your phones out. There were 234,000 net additional homes created in England in 2022-23. Given everything you've heard this morning, how many do you think will be created in 2029? So the answer is no, unsurprisingly, are less than currently, around about the same, marginally more. We'll hit the government's target, or we'll beat the government's target. So let's go along the panel. Let's start with you, Cameron. How are you feeling? Optimistic, pessimistic?
So this is 2029, so this is by the end. And so if the government wants to reach its target of 1.5 million, they'd have to hit E realistically. So I think by 2029, we would be looking more at the answer of D. They'll hit their target of 300,000, but because over the next few years they won't hit 300,000, that means ultimately I think they'll fall short of the 1.5 million.
So sort of tempered optimism.
Yeah.
Sam?
To build 300,000 homes a year, you need a stock right now of over 1 million planning permissions, and you need to add to that stock every year by about 375,000. So on that basis, I would say C.
Okay, we're going down. Temperature dropping any further, James?
I'm overawed by Sam's use of science and numbers, but I'm optimistic that the government will make the right moves. I don't think it'll get there, but I think C+.
C+.
Somewhere between C and D. I think they will. I think NPPF is just the start. They'll do more things, thinking around how they can do stuff. But I take Sam's point that they'll probably, in 5 years, things have to be in place now. But hopefully, and I hope that they do sensible things and we get towards the target and people can appreciate that's enough.
Okay, let's see how the audience, where the audience is. There we go. Everyone's gone for the kind of, the mean decision here. But I mean, on the whole, kind of erring towards more optimism, which is really great to see. It's been an amazing discussion. I've gone 1 minute over. Apologies for people who've got to dash to their next meeting. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Cameron and Cara, for the report. James and Sam, your contributions were fantastically interesting. There were hundreds more questions on Slido, and I know there were people in the room who wanted to ask questions to you. So apologies on that, but I think it's been really wonderful. And I should also say that next week we have an event, our 4th in our 5 Challenges series, which is looking at growth. And that will also consider planning and be asking, sort of going one step further and thinking, well, even if we do build these homes, where do they need to be built to kind of maximise their growth potential? A topic we obviously didn't pick up on today. Anyway, let me thank the panel.